Sarah wiped down the counter, her mind drifting as she moved in the steady rhythm of her work. The small-town diner was quiet today, a rare lull between the morning rush and lunchtime. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with the greasy, comforting aroma of pancakes and bacon. Sarah had worked here for years, decades really, and in all that time she'd seen the same faces, heard the same orders, and yet, somehow it always felt like a new day. Her routine was comforting, predictable. A small world that revolved around the ebb and flow of customers, their chatter, and the clinking of silverware. But today there was something different. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked a young man. He wasn't anyone she recognized, but there was something about him that caught her attention right away. Tall, with a calm demeanor that immediately set him apart from the usual crowd. He looked around the diner, scanning the quiet scene before his gaze landed on her. "Hi there," he said with a soft, genuine smile, stepping toward the counter. His voice was warm, disarming, and she couldn't help but return his smile. She had learned long ago to be polite to everyone, but there was something about him, a certain energy that felt different. "Welcome," she replied, placing a menu in front of him. "What can I get you today?" He hesitated for a moment, then ordered a simple coffee and pancakes. As she moved to prepare his order, she noticed how calm he seemed, almost like he was in no rush, taking everything in at his own pace. He seemed at ease, which was rare in a place like this, where most people came in hurried and distracted, their minds on things far beyond the small meals they were eating. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just another passing face. She'd seen plenty of them over the years, people who came in for a quick bite, ate, and left without a second thought. But this man, this young man who sat there so quietly, made her wonder. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken depth, as if he were carrying something heavy. But, as she often did, Sarah pushed it aside. Her job wasn't to dwell on customer stories. It was to serve them, with a smile, no matter who they were or what they might be going through. She set his coffee down in front of him and took his order to the kitchen. As she worked, she couldn't help but glance over at him. His gaze was now focused on something, maybe nothing at all, but there was a quiet sadness about him that tugged at her heart. When she brought his pancakes to the table, he thanked her with that same soft smile, and she wished she could ask him what was on his mind. But as a waitress, she had learned that there were some stories you didn't push to hear. Still, something about him lingered in her thoughts as she returned to the counter. It wasn't until after his meal, when he asked for the check, that Sarah truly understood why this moment felt so different. Barron. She finally learned his name from his bill, left her a tip that was far beyond anything she'd ever expected. But it wasn't the tip that made her pause. It was the note he had left with it. "Thank you for everything you do. You are seen, and you are appreciated." It was a simple message, but it hit her like a wave. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she wasn't invisible. And as Barron left the diner, smiling softly at her once more, she realized she would never be the same. The note left by Barron didn't just rest on the counter. It lingered in Sarah's mind, gnawing at her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the words, simple though they were. It was the feeling that came with them. A feeling of being seen, of being noticed, in a world that often felt too large and too busy for such small acts of recognition. She held the note in her hands long after Barron had left, the diner now emptier than before. The normal hum of the place, the sound of the coffee machine, the chatter of customers, all seemed muffled in her ears. The message was so brief, yet it carried a weight that made her chest tight. You are seen, and you are appreciated. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything she needed to hear at that moment. Over the next few days, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Barron. What had he meant by that? Why had he left such a personal note? And why had it felt so meaningful to her? It wasn't until she told her coworker Lucy about it that the weight of it truly sank in. Do you know who that was? Lucy had asked after hearing about Barron. That's Barron Trump. He's got some big connections, but he's just a kid, really. I've seen him around a few times with his family, but I never imagined him being so kind. Sarah's eyes widened. Barron Trump? As in, the son of the former president? She had no idea. To her, he had just been a young man who had shared a moment of kindness in the midst of his quiet meal. It didn't matter who he was. What mattered was how he had made her feel. Seen, acknowledged, appreciated in a world where those things were so often forgotten. Soon, her story spread beyond the diner. Word of Barron's small but impactful gesture reached more people than Sarah could have ever imagined. Her regular customers began to notice her differently. The way they smiled at her, the way they treated her. It was as if Barron had unlocked something in the world, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, ripples outward in ways you can never predict. She had no idea how far-reaching this simple exchange would become. What had started as a quiet moment in a diner was slowly beginning to change everything, and Sarah could feel it. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone who mattered. Sarah tried to focus on her other tables, but her mind kept drifting back to him. Barron Trump, sitting in her section, was not just a customer. He was a mystery, and every small detail about him seemed to spark her curiosity. He ate his burger without fanfare, occasionally glancing around the diner with an almost amused expression, as if he were enjoying the charm of a place so different from what he was used to. She wondered what someone like him thought about a diner like this, about someone like her. By the time she brought over the check, her shift was winding down, and she was running on autopilot. "Here you go," she said, placing the small black folder on the edge of his table. He looked up and nodded politely, thanking her once again, and she gave him a quick smile before stepping away. It wasn't until he left that she noticed it. She was clearing the table, her hands moving quickly to wipe down the surface, when she saw the folder still sitting there. Inside was the payment, a generous tip, and a folded piece of paper. Frowning, she picked it up, unfolding it carefully, unsure of what to expect. Her eyes scanned the handwritten words, and the moment she read them, her hands froze. "Thank you for your kindness. It doesn't go unnoticed. Barron." The words were simple, yet they hit her like a tidal wave. Sarah stared at the note, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just what he wrote, it was the fact that he had written anything at all. In her years working as a waitress, she had seen customers leave tips, compliments, and even the occasional complaint scribbled on receipts. But this was different. This wasn't just about her service or the food, it was about her. Her knees felt weak as she sank into the booth, holding the note like it was something precious. She read it again and again, the words blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. When was the last time someone had thanked her, really thanked her, in a way that felt so personal? The other servers noticed her sitting there, wiping her eyes, and they asked if she was okay. She managed a shaky laugh, brushing them off with a wave of her hand. How could she explain it? How could she put into words what that small note meant to her? For Sarah, the daily grind of waiting tables often felt thankless. She'd grown used to being overlooked, to being the invisible figure who brought food and cleared plates. But this note, it reminded her that even in the most ordinary moments, her kindness could matter to someone. Barron Trump might have walked out of the diner without realizing the impact he'd left behind, but for Sarah, that note was more than just words. It was a reminder that she wasn't invisible after all. Sarah sat there for what felt like hours, the folded note clutched tightly in her hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that those words weren't just kind, they were deeply intentional. She thought about Barron's quiet demeanor, his warm smile, and the way he'd thanked her as though he genuinely saw her as more than just a waitress. The note had touched a part of her she hadn't felt in a long time, a part that craved acknowledgement, a sign that her daily struggles meant something. The next day, Sarah arrived at the diner with an unusual spring in her step. Her coworkers teased her, joking that she was glowing. And in a way, she was. For once, she didn't feel like she was just going through the motions of life. That simple note had awakened something in her, hope. As she worked through the lunch rush, she couldn't help but wonder if Barron had any idea how much his small gesture had impacted her. Did he write similar notes to others? Or was she the rare recipient of something he'd felt compelled to do in that moment? Whatever the case, it had made her feel like she mattered, and that was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Later that evening, Sarah was tidying up when a familiar face appeared at the door. It was the diner's owner, Mr. Callahan, holding an envelope in his hand. "This came for you," he said, handing it to her with a curious smile. Sarah frowned, wiping her hands on her apron before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a letter and a small check. She unfolded the paper, her eyes widening as she read the words, "Dear Sarah, I wanted to thank you once again for your kindness and hard work. People like you are the heart of places like this, and your warmth doesn't go unnoticed. Enclosed is a small token of appreciation. Use it for whatever brings you joy. With gratitude, Barron Trump." Her breath caught as she stared at the check. It wasn't small, it was life-changing. Enough to pay off her overdue bills, fix her car, and even set aside a little for her niece's college fund. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the enormity of what had just happened. The other staff gathered around, curious about her reaction. She showed them the letter, and their astonishment mirrored her own. "You've always been the nicest person here," one of them said. "You deserve this." Sarah smiled through her tears, feeling an overwhelming mix of gratitude and disbelief. In all her years of working tirelessly, she'd never expected something like this. Barron's note, his generosity, it wasn't just about the money. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out in ways she never imagined. That night, as Sarah walked home, she felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was truly living. The news spread quickly through the small town. By the next morning, nearly everyone had heard about Barron Trump's visit to the diner and the incredible gesture he left behind. Customers flooded in, eager to sit in Sarah's section, some out of curiosity, others just to share in the joy of her story. For Sarah, it was surreal. She'd spent years blending into the background, and now, she was at the center of attention. "Sarah, you're famous now," one of her regulars joked, sliding into his usual booth. She chuckled, brushing it off, but deep down, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: pride. It wasn't just the recognition. It was the way people now looked at her, not as a waitress, but as someone who mattered. That evening, as the diner emptied out, she sat in her favorite booth, replaying the events in her mind. She still couldn't believe it. The note, the letter, the check. They felt like pieces of a dream she hadn't woken up from yet. But more than anything, she thought about the young man who had changed her life with such a simple act of kindness. She thought about his quiet presence, the way he'd smiled as if he understood her struggles without her saying a word. It wasn't the grand gesture that moved her the most. It was the way he'd taken the time to see her when so many others had overlooked her. As Sarah sat there, the door to the diner jingled open, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up, expecting another late-night customer, but her breath caught in her throat. It was Barron. He smiled shyly, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I hope I'm not bothering you," he said, his voice as calm and kind as she remembered. Sarah stood, her heart pounding. "Not at all," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. I don't even know how to thank you." Barron shook his head, his expression humble. "You don't have to. I just wanted to stop by and make sure you got the letter." She laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "I did. And the check, Barron, it's more than I could ever deserve." He smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief. "You deserve more than that, Sarah. People like you make the world a better place, even if you don't realize it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Barron nodded, glancing around the empty diner. "It's a nice place," he said, his tone light. "I'll have to come back sometime." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart full and her spirit soaring. It wasn't just the money or the note. It was the reminder that kindness could change everything. As the door closed behind Barron, Sarah stood motionless, replaying his words in her mind. It wasn't the check or even the letter that had struck her the most. It was his genuine belief that she deserved kindness, that her daily efforts mattered. She sat back down in the booth, her hands trembling slightly, and stared out the window. The streets outside were quiet, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign reflecting on the pavement. For years, Sarah had believed that her life was just a series of small, unnoticed acts. She wasn't anyone special. She was just a waitress trying to make ends meet. But Barron had seen something in her that no one else had, and that realization brought fresh tears to her eyes. The next day, the diner felt different. Customers were warmer, smiles came easier, and the small-town buzz around Barron's visit hadn't faded. Sarah noticed how people started treating her differently, as if they now saw her with new eyes. Regulars asked about the note and the check, and while she shared bits and pieces of the story, she held the most precious parts close to her heart. It wasn't long before reporters caught wind of the story. Sarah wasn't prepared for the attention. Cameras and microphones were thrust in her face as journalists asked her to relive the moment. At first, it was overwhelming, but she soon realized that her story was inspiring others. Strangers began leaving kind notes on their receipts, paying for someone else's meal, or simply taking a moment to thank their server. One evening, after the last customer had left, Sarah sat in the quiet diner, scrolling through messages on her phone. People from all over the country were reaching out, sharing how her story had touched them. One message stood out. A single mother who wrote about how she often felt invisible in her job as a cashier. "Your story made me feel seen," the woman wrote. "Thank you for reminding me that even the smallest acts of kindness can matter." Sarah clutched her phone, overwhelmed by the ripple effect that Barron's gesture had created. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless people who worked tirelessly, often without recognition, and the reminder that their efforts weren't in vain. As she locked up the diner that night, Sarah paused, looking around the place that had been her second home for so long. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. A space filled with laughter, hard work, and now, a story that had touched hearts far beyond its walls. Walking home under the glow of the streetlights, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. Barron's visit wasn't just a random act of kindness. It was a turning point, a moment that reminded her, and so many others, that the simplest gestures could leave the deepest impact. And for the first time in years, Sarah didn't just feel seen. She felt extraordinary. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind for Sarah. What began as a quiet moment in a small-town diner had blossomed into something far greater than she ever imagined. The world, it seemed, was hungry for stories of kindness and connection, and hers had struck a chord. Messages of hope and gratitude poured in from strangers near and far, each one reminding Sarah of the power of a single act of compassion. But what touched her the most were the changes she saw right in her own diner. Regulars began leaving extra tips, not just for her, but for the other servers too. Families who had never exchanged more than pleasantries with the staff were suddenly taking the time to ask how their days were going. Even the grumpiest of patrons seemed to soften, their orders now peppered with please and thank you. One rainy afternoon, as Sarah wiped down a table by the window, a little girl approached her. She couldn't have been older than 7, her hair in pigtails and her tiny hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "This is for you," the girl said shyly, placing the paper on the table before running back to her mother. Sarah unfolded the note, her heart swelling at the sight of the child's wobbly handwriting. "You are special." It was simple, sweet, and yet it carried the same weight as Barron's note had weeks ago. It was then that Sarah realized the true impact of kindness. It wasn't just about what you gave, but how it inspired others to give too. That evening, as she walked home, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. The note, the check, the letter, it had all been a catalyst. But what mattered most was the chain reaction it had set in motion. It wasn't just her life that had changed. It was her community, her diner, and the countless strangers who had been moved by her story. Standing in her small kitchen, Sarah pulled out a pen and a notebook. She didn't know where this journey would lead her, but she knew one thing for certain. She wanted to keep the momentum going. She began jotting down ideas, ways she could give back, not just to her town, but to people everywhere. The next day, she launched a simple campaign online, Notes of Kindness. She invited people to share stories of small acts that made a big difference. Within days, the campaign went viral, filling social media with heartwarming stories and reminding the world that kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. And now, as you finish hearing Sarah's story, let it be a reminder to you, too. Whether it's a kind word, a small gesture, or a heartfelt note, you have the power to make someone's day, or even their life, better. So, what will your act of kindness be today? If this story inspired you, like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Let's spread kindness one story at a time.